This here will be my presentation on how physics and astrology are connected. This will be my table of contents on everything I'll be touching upon within this video. And most of the information that I'm basing this off of will stem from my third book, Quasi-Dimensionality, an accidental blueprint of the Infinite Improbability Field, as well as my second book, Metaversal Decipherment, the Art of Meaning Mechanics, which I don't have here, but the link to both of my books will be in the description below, as well as instructions on how to best understand anything that I left out or wasn't able to elucidate on within this video. Now I'll read out the table of contents. What are wavelengths? What are shadow particles? What is quantum entanglement? How are shadow particles involved in quantum entanglement? How is the spin of a particle instrumental in coding? How does the Doppler effect affect particles? How does the Doppler effect, as it pertains to particles, cause planets and other celestial objects within astrology to mirror the dynamic going on between particles? And lastly, how the information encoded within particles, and not just with particles as a whole, could explain how physical objects can be found within particles, as well as with symbols, so as to use that information as a way to transfer the algorithm involved, with instructing the ways in which reality will experience itself being shaped, such as the waves of an ocean being reflective of what's presented within a particle, or DNA being integral to our physical existence. In other words, how interpretations made within astrology are capable of functioning as a two-way street for the nature of reality to be influenced by them. Now, with that out the way, we can begin with the presentation. Now, as you see here, you see an image of what a wavelength would look like. You see the energy level increasing and decreasing. You're seeing this repeated motion, repeated pattern as to how much it will increase and decrease at any given time. A low energy wavelength will be far more elongated and spread out, whereas a more energized wavelength will be more rapid and closely tied together without much gaps in the rising and falling of its energy state. What are wavelengths? Wavelengths represent both the visual representation of what is happening when the energy levels of a particle is rising and falling, with the amount of oscillations involving those rises and falls at any given time to show if the particle is consistently of a high energy state or if it's consistently of a low energy state. For instance, the radio wave, which is the least energized version of the photon or light particle, will have the most elongated depictions of a wavelength, due to the limited energy of the photon being too small to carry it up and down with any substantial degree of momentum and velocity. Which goes into the second purpose of the wavelength, is meant to be the mechanism used to track the movements that a particle will make within space-time, or rather, the most probable means of movement that a particle will make, since tracking the exact position of a particle within space-time being the three dimensions of space and one dimension of time said to represent what the nature of physical reality as we know it, will prove to be a futile endeavor. But what isn't acknowledged about wavelengths is that they represent the physical characteristics of a particle, and not just the conceptual one, meaning that a particle will be comprised of actual waves of energy, as in physical waves. What are shadow particles? Shadow particles are the wavelengths within a wavelength, or to be precise, they are the exact copy of the initial wavelength of a particle, just with the rises and falls of the inner wavelength to fit into the spaces that the initial wavelength will make. That's why they are called shadow particles, because they act as shadows of the wavelength which was able to cast them, for their proportions will be smaller with each iteration, but their contents, such as the amount of oscillations from the higher energy state to the lower energy state, will be the same as the wavelengths that they came from. Therefore, if the initial wavelength were a musical key, like the key of E, the shadow particles would also be of that key, just of a different octave. within this figure here, you'll see the initial wavelength that I'm referring to, let's say is of the key E within music. Then the next band of energy, the next wavelength within it, which is still the same wavelength but also different at the same time, will also be of the key E, just a different octave. And the same thing will continue on indefinitely. That's what a shadow particle is. What is quantum entanglement? The thing about the particle is that it can spin in one of several directions. And if having a particle experiences itself being affected by the presence of another particle, so as to have that presence lead to the spin being altered, thereby causing the spin to go in the opposite direction, since particles don't stop spinning, were to cause it to have the spin of another particle, not the one which caused the spin to change, but another one altogether, and with the distance between the particles being a non-factor in whether or not their spins will be changed because of them, then what you'll have here is the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where the spin of a particle is synchronized with the spin of another particle, that the shift in spin going on with one particle to another will happen within an instant, as though no time would have passed. Now, as for why the particle spins, though it has yet to be confirmed within the physics community, I believe the reason for its spin is because the constant extending and contracting of wavelengths occurring within a particle is in essence causing a particle to be nudged to the side with each extending in the wavelength that the wavelengths within a particle will do or cause. As you see here, this is an image of a particle spinning in one direction and an image of a particle spinning in another direction. And when they're entangled, they're both going to be spinning in the same direction, where if you affect the spin of one particle, it'll alter the spin of the other particle. That's how you know that they're entangled, as you see here. How are shadow particles involved in quantum entanglement? Because the shadow particle represents the future iteration of the initial particle's wavelength, and that the entirety of every possible iteration of that particle's existence throughout time and space will live on within the particle, sort of like a nexus point, in accessing every version that the particle will embody itself as, or a portal meant to reach its future and past selves. The way for a shadow particle to entangle itself to a particle not initially like itself, such as an electron entangling itself with a proton, would be for the particle to take its main or most extended wavelength and use parts of the shadow wavelengths that it has as material to help create a composite wavelength, where the combined wavelengths which overlap each other will bring about the creation of a wavelength that would match in frequency to the wavelength of a particle that it wasn't even being. But that's only how entanglement between particles of every kind form. As for the method used by these particles to send the signal that the spin of these particles are in need of shifting, I would say that the two of them, which is really one expressed within two distinct means, are the most likely ways that it would do so. First of them being that the particles whose spin was altered would then send a shock wave throughout space-time, as the reverberation of the particle's wavelength will move throughout space-time like waves traveling across the ocean, but at speeds far exceeding that of light travel, given that these wavelengths will avoid being detected and interfered with by other particles until the wavelength will reach the particle that it was entangled with and use the information embedded within the wavelength to help instruct it on what it needs to do. The other method entails having the particle itself function as a portal that it will use to send a shock wave within itself so that it may reach either another version of itself or an entirely different particle. This is what it looks like when two entangled particles, both of the same spin, is sending out a shock wave of energy, a shock wave that is reverberating throughout space-time at faster than light travel, which is why it appears as though it happens in an instant, because it's faster than any means of detection that we typically have. That's the first method, and the second method involves it sending energy waves within itself. Sort of like its own wormhole of sorts. How is the spin of a particle instrumental in coding? When it comes to the nature of computer science, the spin of a particle will be given a number, either 0 or 1, depending on which direction that is spinning, and will use a myriad of these particles as placeholders for these numbers, with these numbers serving as the code that will be eventually used by an algorithm being a set of instructions given to a device to ensure that it will achieve the task that it was meant to, and have it become translated into something which can be understood, such as taking a code and turning it into an image, a text message, a video or audio recording, and so on. This process also occurs with the way in which DNA will act as code for the cell's algorithm to take the information being given to it, which then will be organized into becoming an organic life form. As you see here, you have the spin of one particle going one direction, the spin of another particle going the another direction. If it's going in one direction, it'll be given a number, let's say 0. If it's going in another direction, it'll be given another number, let's say 1. This is a binary code that is used in computer science to demonstrate, to basically code things, code programs, and what have you. That a computer will take it and use an algorithm to translate that code into something recognizable, like a text message, video, audio files, or what have you. How does the Doppler effect affect particles? The Doppler effect occurs when the listener's proximity to a source of sound will increase or decrease the intensity of the sound, with the further the sound is, leading to it being less noticeable, and the closer one is to it, leading to greater recognition of the noise. And since sound waves are still waves, just with them being sent through the air, if the waves of a particle were treated the same way, then having a particle come closer to another particle will surely cause the wavelengths of these particles to also grow in size and intensity, with the growing in size that these particles will experience to bring with it greater ease to have the wavelength of one particle align itself to the wavelength of the incoming particle, or rather, it's each particle's perspective on the other, which would allow for this to happen, while any perspective other than that will only see these particles being physically distant from each other, for it's the aligning of the wavelengths of these particles so as to cause the wavelengths of both particles to become one extended host of wavelengths, as if these particles were now one particle, are now one particle and not two. This is how it would look. When you look at the particle from up above, more so, you see the wavelengths as well as the shadow particles. Really, you can say all of its wavelengths and as well as shadow particles all in one. You may think of this as the most recognizable wavelength, or what one would consider is typical or main wavelength, more than likely. The most expanded upon wavelength. And all these more likely being its shadow wavelength. They increase and decrease and expand and contract as they move from here to here. And when two particles come together, if they align, even though they're distant, from their perspective, it's like they are connecting. So you don't see any connection from the outside, you just see distance. But from their perspective, it's like they're aligning with each other. How does the Doppler effect, as it pertains to particles, cause planets and other celestial objects within astrology to mirror the dynamic going on between particles? Within astrology, if two planets were to overlap each other from the perspective of the observer, and they were both of the same sign, then the effect of that celestial alignment would cause them to form a conjunction. And just like with the previous explanation as to what would happen if two particles were to get close enough to each other to have their wavelengths blend into each other, if two planets or celestial objects, like asteroids or even points within space, were to find alignment with each other, then the byproduct of that will be an entanglement of their energies, which means the associated traits of both planets or objects would essentially come together. Whereas for trines and sextiles within astrology, if the most immediate shadow particle of the initial or main wavelength were to come into contact with the wavelength of another particle of the same kind, such as an electron coming into contact with another electron, then the like frequency of both particles would lead to a smooth encounter between them, due to both frequencies being within the same key, but of different octaves. While for oppositions and squares, if the wavelength of a particle were to come into contact with another particle and they weren't the same type, like an electron with a proton, the differing wavelengths would clash, causing a slowing down of their fluctuations because of the interference that they would cause each other. In the last portion of this presentation, how the information encoded within particles, and not just with particles as a whole, could explain how physical objects can be found within particles, as well as with symbols, so as to use that information as a way to transfer the algorithm involved with instructional ways in which reality will experience itself being shaped, such as the waves of an ocean being reflective of what's presented within a particle, or DNA being integral to our physical existence. In other words, how interpretations made within astrology are capable of functioning as a two-way street for the nature of reality to be influenced by them. In short, if the planet Mars, for instance, were to have an effect on our state of being, then how it would do so would entail having it function as a symbol for a particular code, similar to the binary code of zeros and ones being used within computing, with the algorithm present within the species of humanity, as in their ideas about the mythology of the god of war, Ares, and how Ares is the Greek name for its Roman counterpart, Mars, to serve as the mechanism that will help instruct the particles which make up the atoms, which make up the molecules, which make up the cells, which make up the organs, which make up our bodies, and how the altering of the chemicals which affect the functioning of said bodies will inevitably lead to our neurology being affected, which in turn will have an effect on both our psychology and collective sociology. And that here will be my presentation on how physics and astrology are connected. If you need more information on this, you can look into the description below and follow the instructions presented there if you need more information. Or look at my other videos, which touch on more things I've said in this video.